I helped to do my best to help to create the new permit for MS4 that's in effect now, that started in March of 2018. So I know the permit and all the rules like the back of my hand. So I've worked for the center for 2 years, but I do mostly stormwater design and really assisting municipalities with MS4 and other regulatory type work. So there's a certain permit that we'll talk about how it came into be that really just governs how municipalities handle their stormwater. And there's two different kinds. There's one for big folks like Philadelphia, and then there's ones for smaller folks, just regular municipalities, and that's what they call the Phase 2 one. It's a smaller permit. So there's about 1,000 small municipal permits out there, and so PADEP really knows how to handle that, and that's what drives the whole ball game. Your situation is very difficult for them, and they have a tough time with understanding sort of how to do it because there's only 2 large permits that are out there. I have this in a slide later, but just for fun, can anybody guess who the 2 are? Yeah, so it's actually Philly, but it's Allentown. There was a huge public movement around the 1960s with the Cuyahoga River that set forward a chain of events that created the EPA and the Clean Water Act. The Clean Water Act, one of the first things they went to do, and a lot of what we're going to talk about today, are permits that deal with point sources. So if there's a pipe, a channel, or something that you can point to that then discharges into a stream, that set forward what we know now as the Clean Water Act and all of these rules that are in play. And they call it the non-point discharge elimination system. And one of those permits is the MS4 permit that we're going to talk about. Chapter 102 is another one as well. And really, like, a lot of this is to just sort of demonstrate why stormwater runoff is an issue. Like, who really cares about it? So the rivers used to catch fire. They created the permits to go after point sources. And what they found is once you get at cleaning up industries and you get at wastewater treatment plants, which are also a really big issue, then a lot of people, I think, would just sort of consider the job done, right? Like, well, what's left to do? And on the DEP website, they explain how it's basically there's a whole world of what's left to do. So those are just what they call the low-hanging fruit. There's still 19,000 miles of rivers and streams in Pennsylvania that are impaired for multiple reasons, and stormwater runoff pollution is one of the primary drivers for that whole thing.
How many miles ago?
I don't know, actually. Up 19,001. No, I'm just kidding. I would guess, if I had to guess, from looking at EMAP-PA, which is a tool that I want to show you guys later today, easily two-thirds. What's that? I was going to say 2/3, but 3/4 is probably, yeah, about right.
I think the actual number is 95%.
For some reason, shape, or form to be impaired. And I wouldn't be surprised by that either. I think 75 is a really safe sort of number to go with, but it could be a lot higher. So, and really, that's why we're here today. A lot of what we're talking about is stormwater runoff. And the reason is like you can control the industries, you can cut down on the discharge of oil and grease and wastewater pollutants, but there is still a lot of work to be done. And a lot of it just has to do for the obvious reasons. Every time it rains and it takes all of these land uses and it just dumps it as fast as it can into the stream. And that's what, in the areas that we live in Pennsylvania, I'm from Missouri where things are a lot newer. Old out there is like Civil War and later, but you know, there's just been a lot of development over time and there were never rules about how to manage stormwater from that. So a lot of this just goes unchecked into our rivers and streams. So the permit stuff that we're going to talk about are newer sort of amendments to the Clean Water Act that then set forward these other ways to manage stormwater. So the MS4 permit is one of the permits that came forward from the Clean Water Act, and it got started in the late 90s. And MS4 stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System. So it's like an M with 4 S's, and that's the acronym. The definition of that is a conveyance or system of conveyances, which is basically just anything that has water that drains off of it. So it can be a road, it can be a drainage ditch, it can be a curb, it includes your inlets, channels, your whole storm drain piping network. What's important to realize is that it is not limited to, and a lot of people think of this in municipalities and otherwise, or various elected officials, as being something that is just pipes and inlets. But it is absolutely not. It includes all ways by which it's roads that don't even have curbs. Anything that's like a municipal road that drains stormwater down is also a part of the municipal separate storm sewer system.
How do you go about changing that view on the part of the township's officers, that it's simply the actual sewer system that is to be addressed, not everything else that isn't? In my township, there's a lot that is not connected by the actual sewer system.
Yeah, but would still be regulated. Absolutely. I do not have an answer for it. It takes, I have only been able to talk to municipal officials a handful of times in my professional life. So mostly as a regulator, who I deal with is a middle person who is a township engineer, sometimes a township manager, but usually a township engineer that's a paid consultant. And I have no clue what goes past that filter to the next level. So we have always sought to try to have the ear of elected officials so that we could try to get to the heart and not have a filter so that they could understand this information. But it is a very common misconception, and yeah, something that needs to get passed.
So you're saying that the MS4 covers really any gray infrastructure that affects the flow of the water?
And
green, anything
Well,
by which stormwater
this-
flows.
And that was going to be my next question, is I more think that you're going to deal with the misconception that it has to be gray infrastructure, that how you get green infrastructure, because I don't really see it in that definition there.
Yeah, so this is the like sort of Clean Water Act, like broader, bigger scale definition, but it's absolutely in the permit conditions that we'll talk about later, that you need to map and identify every single thing that water could possibly flow through. And it includes basins and rain gardens and all the infrastructure too, in the Pennsylvania MS4 permit. But what's important to note here is that it's something that we talked about before, which is why Pittsburgh is not the other large MS4 out there, is because the MS4 is basically everything that is not combined sewer. Combined sewer, for folks who might not be familiar with that term, is where your stormwater drains into your wastewater pipes, and it goes to a wastewater treatment plant. It is a separate set of permit conditions because it deals with overtaxing the ability of the wastewater plant to take that stormwater in. So they have a whole set of rules by which how they would try to treat that, or how they can only discharge like a few times into rivers and streams. This is like the sister permit. This is everything that doesn't go to that combined system or to a wastewater treatment plant that would just go essentially untreated if it weren't for green infrastructure into a receiving water body. So we talked about the large MS4s. Here's an approximate map of the MS4s. So the MS4s are not every single municipality in Pennsylvania. And what it is it's governed by something, which I'm going to talk about here in a minute, called the urbanized area. So what the federal government did whenever they created this program, so this is not a Pennsylvania thing, and I want to be really clear about that. Again, this is because of the Federal Clean Water Act. So the EPA made up this program, and then every state that has what they call primacy. So some states just say, hey, we're not dealing with this. EPA, you implement all the regulations here. Massachusetts is one of them, and there's only a couple others. New Mexico might be another one. But most states have their own version of the EPA, which is what I used to work for, the DEP. So the DEP then and PA can either take the very minimum set of standards that the feds set forward, or they can make it more stringent if they want to. Pennsylvania sort of had to make it more stringent in some ways because of the Chesapeake Bay. And so the Chesapeake Bay has driven us. So it's not as though they chose to make it more stringent, but it's because we have an extra set of circumstances because the middle part of the state, the whole middle part, all drains into the Chesapeake Bay.
Chesapeake Bay, I didn't get that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the urbanized area is something that comes from the federal census, and it's something that the EPA put into the MS4 permit to identify who has to be MS4. Urbanized area is just a look at, and I think I have a map here. It's a weird, funky boundary that's drawn by them. So they take information about a density of a population, and they'll go to a population center. So for example, if you were in Reading, there is a Reading urbanized area. Reading is the heart of it, and then the metro area encompasses the rest, and they'll just draw what keeps a population density on average to about 1,000 per square mile, I believe is what that threshold is for that density. And what it does is you can see these municipal boundaries, kind of. So you can see somebody here has this really weird shape for a municipality, but they have this little bit of urbanized area here, and they have a little corridor that comes out there, and it's like a tag grid. So now they're in MS4 because even a little bit of urbanized area touches them. However, they're only responsible for the urbanized area for the permit conditions. So it doesn't bring the whole municipality to have to meet this, it just brings in the urbanized area fraction of it, which can matter. I see some people shaking their heads, and that actually can be a huge deal, and it can be stifling to some good projects too, unfortunately. Yes?
So are those based on census?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is, what we're looking at here is the 2010 census, to be specific about it. So then there will be, the 2010 just got incorporated into the MS4 program in PA, but there will be another one in 2020. And then it'll take until the next permit cycle for then that information to drive the next round of permitting forward.
This kind of thinking allows areas that aren't developed yet to develop in ways which have led to the problem in developed areas to begin with. So it seems. They don't have to act by these regulations because we're not in MS4 area now.
I don't think new construction allows you to have combined systems, does it?
Well, no, you can't build. If anything, they try to separate systems now, no matter what. But yeah, I mean, the municipalities who are not touched by urbanized area are pretty rural. However, I should absolutely be clear about the fact that the term urbanized area is really a misnomer and not to go from. You would be surprised if you looked at, I'm actually working with a bunch of MS4s to try to credit agricultural practices that are within the urbanized area. Because the farther you go away from the population center, they draw this based off their own sort of way of doing it. They just need to keep the density there, but they kind of stretch the boundary out. If we were to put an aerial behind this, you would see massive pockets of farms scattered throughout this. So yeah, it's called an urbanized area. It's based off of the census, but it is full of open space and other areas like ag and otherwise that are in there. So it's just the way. You can imagine that if you're working at the EPA, you're trying to create this permit realm, you're trying to keep every municipality from the country from not having to be it, but try to justify who would have to. And honestly, I don't know this for a fact, but my best guess is this was just the easiest way for them to try to take something that looked urbanized and say, okay, here's a way to tag these people into this program. There's two main aspects to the MS4 permit that I want to talk about here today. One is a set of general criteria that everybody has to do. And another one is a plan that municipalities would have made to show how they're meeting the stormwater runoff pollution requirements that were set forward for this permit term. And so, in a nutshell now, I have slides about it later, but since we're talking about it so much now, the very, very short of it is that there's such a thing called a TMDL. And a TMDL is an acronym that stands for Total Maximum Daily Load. The federal requirements that every state would have had to adopt, so this is countrywide, not universal, nationwide, is that if a stream is listed as impaired for certain sets of criteria, then there's a clock that's supposed to start. And it's that either the stream gets fixed and gets unimpaired, or if enough time goes by, you have to create a pollution diet, is what folks typically liken this to, which would then be a modeling analysis that would show, here's how much the stream can handle of a certain pollutant. Here's what's happening now, and here's the difference. So this much has to get resolved and taken out of this watershed in order to get this stream back to where it needs to go. They call that a TMDL, a total maximum daily load plan. So MS4s that discharge to one of those for sediment or nutrients. Now there are TMDLs for every kind of impairment that you can think of under the sun. There's TMDLs for metals, there's TMDLs for pathogens, there's TMDLs for PCBs and things like that. But MS4s, this permit that we're talking about in Pennsylvania, are only responsible for sediment and nutrient TMDLs, and that's it. Other states, by the way, are different. So Maryland is quite different, but that's Pennsylvania decided to do this sort of baby step approach to building the TMDL compliance into the MS4. And people can, I think, visualize and understand sediment and nutrients from municipal runoff more than they can understand bacteria and things like that. Yeah, exactly. PRP is then another thing that Pennsylvania decided to do, which is different than other states. So what they said is, we don't just care about those that discharge to TMDLs. They want to try to go after all the impairments themselves. So even if a stream hasn't been created into a full sort of TMDL kind of category, they said any MS4 that discharges within 5 miles of an impairment is triggered into having to create a plan on how they will reduce 10% of their sediment or 5% of their phosphorus that would discharge to those streams. And the PRP is what they called that, and that stands for Pollution Reduction Plan.
Is it 5%?
5% for phosphorus, but 10% for sediment. Now, just to muddy the waters for you, they decided to say phosphorus can be, I don't know, a pain for some to have to account for. So they said, you know what, you can just use sediment as the coin that you can count compliance towards. So most everyone throughout the entire Commonwealth who has a pollution reduction plan or a TMDL plan to meet basically just used sediment and calculated their sediment runoff from the areas they didn't parse out, and then calculated what that total sediment load was, and then they need to take 10% of that load and put in best management practices that will then reduce that 10%. Now, they were allowed to do phosphorus, but I don't know anybody that did. I'm sorry? So nitrogen is a different animal, and the Bay program, I think, would have liked to have seen nitrogen included a lot more. However, the DEP decided to take a more, what they felt was more defensible approach and say, well, people could argue about nitrogen. It moves within the groundwater table. It does different things. However, people can visualize and understand sediment and phosphorus. So they stuck with those two as what they were looking at. For stormwater BMPs, it can be funky. I mean, yeah, there can be a lot of conversation about that for sure. But they thought it was a lot easier to explain to municipal officials and others that because you can see dirt. You know what I mean? You can see dirt, and then phosphorus is a nutrient that attaches to dirt.
Now, you said watershed isn't municipal, and I'm just wondering, does it stop at the municipal boundaries, or is this inclusive of a watershed as it's on?
So a TMDL would be created for a watershed. So it would be a watershed analysis. However, you can't have any legal hold. So this is where the watershed versus municipal boundary thing, you can't create any form of enforcement to any level of permit. Like you just can't give a permit to a watershed, but you can give a permit to a municipality. So what they do within the TMDL boundaries for the watershed is divide that up and say, okay, City of Reading, you're responsible for this load. Wyomissing Borough, you're responsible for this load. Moton Borough, you're responsible for this load. And they divvy it up to them because ultimately there's no enforcement that could be done except for to an individual jurisdiction. So in general, for permit background, there's two kinds of permits that are available. And you're going to fall within one of two categories in your municipality if you're an MS4. One is a general permit, which is kind of considered a blanket permit that just has standardized sets of conditions. So that if nothing special is going on in your municipality, if you don't discharge to a special protection water, which is high quality or exceptional value waters, if you're not working in a collaborative setting or you don't have anything really different or unusual, you can fall in this blanket set of conditions. However, if you do have something special going on, because you discharged, again, to high quality or exceptional value waters, or because you discharged to a TMDL, which we talked about those plans, the TMDL plans, then you're now triggered to need to have an individual permit. And that's something that Penn Future, the gentleman there in the back, his organization, they actually sued the DEP to make it that way. So I don't mean to I want to call you out for this being a really, really good thing. What Penn Future went out of their way to do is to work with DEP and to work with DEP in order to provide the ability for the public to comment on pollution reduction plans, but specifically they started by getting a comment for the TMDL plans. Because before they did their work, there was no way for you to even get to say a word about this. So they're specifically responsible for that, and it is like actually a huge bravo. So the general construct of the permit is that there's kind of like two things going on. One is a certain set of things that aren't really about stormwater BMPs as much as they're about commonsensical approaches to getting at some pollution like work and kind of managing your municipality. These are called the minimum control measures. And they're very important because there's a lot of work that can be done for folks in this room to help to assist within these. These are the basic, this is the basic structure of the MS4 permit. So there's 6 minimum control measures, and they call them MCMs, 1 through 6. So the first 2, as you can see, directly require the municipality. This is not something that is an option. This is something that is in their permit to do. And I want to be really clear about this. They have to educate the public and to involve the public in some capacity. So a lot of folks who work with EACs that I've worked with, or other folks that seek to assist the municipalities, find this as the #1 gateway by which to get in and to assist in some capacity. Is there anybody who does that already in the room? Okay. So the requirements to do this are, in a nutshell, to help to develop and implement and maintain a written program. So there has to be, there's like a document that's created by which they sort of structure, here's how we're going to go about educating the public and involving them in the work that we would do at the municipality. So this is not an inclusive list, but this is like a good chunk of it. So they need to develop a target audience group that can include residents, businesses, developers, schools, whoever they think that they want to engage from the public, and what would be key members of the public to help to inform them. And then they need to publish at least 1 issue of a newsletter, a pamphlet, a flyer, or have information on their website that talks about general stormwater stuff, a description of what the municipality is doing for their stormwater program. Those MCMs that I described before, that's the stormwater management program, but it will also include the pollution reduction plan. And then any information that they want to share then about the activities and how that's been met. So again, this is not just something that you could offer because it's just interesting. This is something they need to do. And I think it's a really key gateway to get in and to try to build a relationship with them. Mm-hmm.
municipality actually does this?
That's in here too. So there's an annual report that they would file, and that's another thing that you can help to do, is to gather the information that you did on their behalf to meet these requirements and provide it to them in such a way that they can take that and put that into their annual report to get it checked. So one thing I want to make sure that everybody understands from today is that all of the information that you would need about the MS4 program in Pennsylvania is right here. And you just have to type in PADEP, municipal stormwater. This is the MS4 page, essentially. And if you wanted to look at the actual permit itself, it's right here. By doing so, you may be doing more than the township engineer ever did.
And that would be the permit for your township?
This is the general permit that exists, but these kind of things we're talking about, everybody has to do. There's a version of this in there for Philadelphia Water to do as well, although it's a little bit different. But I do want to call out real quick, there is a public involvement / participation minimum control measure as well. And there's to be a written plan that needs to include how there's to be opportunities for the public to participate in the decision-making processes associated with the development, implementation, and update of programs and activities related to the permit. So it's written in here. This was created by the feds as to have 2 out of 6, 1/3 of the permit is to be how the public is to know and be able to have the opportunity to participate in this process. Now, the actual on-the-ground work of that is different, and it doesn't really play out that way. But this permit was made to have things be very much public involved. And there's plenty of opportunities to assist with these as well. In all of these, again, I showed you where the permit is itself, so you can go look at the actual word-for-word requirements, and then I showed you the report, which breaks down how the municipality will report back that they did this or didn't do it. That's all of that is true for each one of these. So one of the heavy hitters in this program is what they call the illicit discharge detection and elimination sort of program, or MCM. What they're required to do with this is to create a written plan that talks about how they're going to educate residents, again, on not to dump your oil or other things down the storm drain, and then about how they're going to go and check their outfalls at a certain interval of time to see if there's anything called what they call a dry weather flow. So dry weather flow is that in different states do it different ways. Pennsylvania was 72 hours, and I think it still is, but it might have been changed to 48. I'd have to go and look at the permit. But I believe it's 72 hours. So if it rains, you're supposed to wait 3 days so that there's no chance that it's rain coming out of a storm sewer pipe that you go look at. If you go look at the end of a pipe or somewhere where you discharge to a stream, and if you see something coming out, well, then you know it's not rain and it's coming from somewhere else. And then you're supposed to find that and trace it back upstream to find who the culprit is. And then you're supposed to have an ordinance that you would have adopted that's a part of the stormwater management ordinance we'll talk about here in a bit that would give you the enforcement capability to then find those people for doing it if they didn't stop on their own. Most municipalities, just FYI, don't fine unless they have to. They usually go and say, we found this, you shouldn't be doing this, we both know it, I don't want to have to come back, please don't make me come back. And then they just go back and then check up later and see if it indeed stopped, and they'll let it go. We'll talk about that a little bit more too when it gets to the ordinance part of it, though. There are times when I believe you should use enforcement criteria, and there's a line in the model ordinance that has a blank number. And I'll point it out later on, but I always encourage folks to put a high number in there, because just because you have the ability to fine somebody a maximum of $10,000 per day doesn't mean that every single penalty you hand out has to be $10,000. But I've seen municipalities, multiple ones, get burnt by having $500 written in that category, and then they had somebody who was like an apartment, big old apartment sort of building. This is a true story where somebody then had a major sewage backup that filled like a huge acres big basement full of raw sewage. That person went went right to Home Depot or Lowe's, got themselves a pump, hooked it up, and then just put it right in the storm sewer system. And the municipality was stuck with charging them $500. That was the only enforcement they had. For something that's big enough, DEP has the ability to go through and add to that, but it's just easier if you have a good amount in there up front to recoup your own costs. Because imagine the amount of time that your municipal engineer and your municipal employees, your public works folks had to spend out there messing with this person and sort of rectifying that situation. I'm sorry, she has been waiting so patiently.
What if the point of origin is in another municipality?
Then they need to trace it back up and call that municipality, and they need to document all of those actions. So from the time that you saw something occurring to how you walked it back upstream, if you found it was outside of your jurisdiction, then that you notified who it was and put the date, time, who you talked to, and all of that written in writing as a part of your follow-up. And then it's outside, if it's in another municipality, it's outside your jurisdiction. At that point, you've done your due diligence. Now, a major tenet of this minimum control measure is mapping. And this is where anything and everything that is within the urbanized area that we described, so not necessarily the whole municipality, but the urbanized area, every single channel, every single road, every single catch basin, inlet, every single pipe, every single stormwater basin, rain garden, et cetera, would all need to be mapped. And the reason that it's in this MCM for that to be done is because that's what enables you to trace something back upstream once you see it coming out of a pipe. That's the whole sort of logic behind it. So, one of the things that people could do, and this is something that is a new topic, and this sort of dovetails with something I know that I talked with somebody earlier about before we started the program. I'm working with a municipality who's exploring doing something called Adopt a Drain. And what they want to do is use an ESRI storyboard. Is there anybody familiar with that term in here? So you can create a map that will then, that can be viewable and manipulatable to as many people as you want it to be. Now you can set it to where your municipality is the only one that can operate it. Or you can set it to where it has full control over anybody and everybody. So you can kind of play with it somewhat. And you could have storm sewer drains or blocks or something that would be your EAC or your people that live within the community could say, this is mine, and I look after it. So that if you see an illicit discharge occurring, you could call. Or that some municipalities have major issues with heavy rain events to where the inlets can get clogged or blocked. And it is extremely helpful to them if you are able to break that up in a storm. So if you're able to go through and sweep off the debris from covering up the inlet to make sure it doesn't get bypassed and create a problem downstream. So that is something that I wanted as a major take-home that I wanted to bring forward as an idea. That's something that public works folks could love that you could do to help out with. So there are the next two, which are MCM4 and MCM5. And these are both associated with new and redevelopment. So this is the part of the permit that deals with construction site stormwater and the after construction permanent stormwater management that goes on. From a perspective of an outsider doing this work, really the number one thing to understand is that if you see brown water coming off a construction site, then that's bad, and that shouldn't be occurring. And that means that the erosion and sediment control BMPs that are put in place are either not functioning because there was a bad design or they weren't put in right, or it means that there is a storm large enough that it has just bypassed those. And there's nothing that can actually be done about that. If you have some of the super intense events that we get lately, they're not designed to necessarily handle that. So I just want to throw that word to the wise out there. If you're going and you're reporting to a conservation district who handles those kind of things, so for folks who may not be aware, there is, the PADEP deals with construction site runoff some, but mostly who deals with it are county staff, whose job it is to go around to construction sites and make sure that these things are all put in correctly. And you can then call them and let them know that you see something, and that would be the most efficient direct line to get something done about it, is to call the conservation district. However, like I said, if it's a small rain event and you see brown water going, well, then you know there's a problem. If it was a 9 inches in like 24-hour kind of event, they're not designed to handle that. So don't be surprised if that's what they come back to you with in some way. Yep.
On a construction site, an individual, if they saw this happening, they shouldn't call the township code enforcement?
I would do that as well, but yeah. So if you were an EAC, actually, thank you. I should have said it differently. The conservation district would be one of the, so you should probably call the township first. The township will immediately call the conservation district. However, it could be, depending on which conservation district it is, it could be minutes or it could be a few days, depending on which county you're in. They are understaffed just like every other government entity, and some of them atrociously so, but then some of them have other forms of money that they're able to get, and they're just able to keep more people. But I stand corrected. If you wanted to help the municipality and you were seeking to be a part of that, I would definitely, hopefully have the relationship by which you had a point person that you could just call and say, hey, this is what I saw. Some people, and that point person could be different depending on the municipality, and that they would let you know who that was. Sometimes that would really just be the public works department, although some people might like it to be the codes and zoning people. So the rules for what you brought up are right in the permit. And this is another thing, but this is a complicated issue. This is MCM5, which is the post-construction, right here. And this is where you're supposed to, first of all, enact, implement, and enforce an ordinance. And those are all very important words to note. So this is your stormwater management ordinance, and it doesn't just say have one around. It says implement and enforce this ordinance. So if you wanted to get technical about it, this is what, if you did not enforce your ordinance, you were not complying with this part of this permit. Well, yeah, and I'm not, and I am not, yeah, that is, it's just that if some folks are upset about development or about certain things, and those people didn't comply with an ordinance condition, yeah, I just wanted to point out that that was there. But no, that's a whole can of worms, and it's a little bit of what we're going to touch on today, but it's something that's really complicated and involves a lot.
And the whole aspect of grandfathering developments that are like 30 years old, and the ordinances might have been changed since then.
So that's a part of this conversation very much right here. So one of the things that is in this permit, and is BMP number 3, is that you're to ensure adequate operation and maintenance of all the post-construction stormwater BMPs that have been involved, that have been put into development and redevelopment for anything essentially since March 10th, 2003. Now, anything older than that is definitely a problem area. Some municipalities, they like to go back and they like to make sure that people fix things. However, this permit basically requires you to deal with stuff that was put in for a permitting process that really kicked in 2003.
Until that area gets redeveloped.
Well, yeah, and honestly, that would be like the single best thing that could happen if you had a problem basin, is that somebody came in, did something new, that then they tried to use that basin as a part of that stormwater management, because now the ordinance requirements have a very detailed operation and maintenance agreement with it. So a modern facility would have a document that would be very clear. Here's your obligations right here, so that you could point back and say you did not do this. However, stuff that was done before the more modern ordinance kicked in, it becomes much more difficult to sort of deal with. Now, sometimes the operation and maintenance would be this little sort of blurb that's tucked into a plan set and may be difficult to find, if even at all, and it becomes very difficult for them to try to enforce that something's there. The only thing that you could really do past that, if you had a very problem situation, is if you could show that there was a discharge of sediment or something coming out of it from storm events because it has just been so neglected over time, you could try to get your conservation district or the DEP to come out and look at it, and then try to go at it from a clean streams law violation is what they call it. And that's about the most that you could really do for an older basin. One of the most cost-effective ways to put a pollution reduction practice in for your pollution reduction plan or for your TMDL is to take an old ragged basin and fix it back up and do what they call naturalize it. Basically turn it into a big rain garden. So we had one of the pollution reduction plans that we wrote, we put in like 25 of those. Like all the old 1980s, 1990s basins that were out there. You can go, you can kind of amend the soils and add some extra sort of storage space within it, and then you can elongate the flow path. Lots of times, have you guys seen basins that have an in here and an out right here, but then the basin is like really long, shaped like this, but the water never goes back over there? So then you can put and add like a little hill, like a little berm they call it, to help to get the water to spread itself out over that way. And you can line that with vegetation all along the way to help soak up that water. And it's a really cheap way. You already have land associated for stormwater management, so you're not asking for new land. And then you're taking something that already has some level of control built in, and you're just enhancing that functionality.
So these are catch basins at a municipality?
Detention basins. It can be, well, you can retrofit any. What's that? Yeah, it's just like old stormwater basins, old stormwater control basins. So a detention basin is something that would be built not to treat water, but just to hold on to it and slow it down so that it would then not go and just flood downstream. So in the 70s, 80s, 90s, yeah, we're winging it in this whole presentation. We're going to have to skip whole sections, all right? But in a super condensed nutshell, in the 70s, Pennsylvania was actually super progressive. We're one of the first people to ever really deal with stormwater management in a modern-esque way at all. So you see basins that were built here in the 1970s. Anything that was built for the 70s, 80s, and pretty much through the 90s would be built almost solely with the purpose of controlling floods. So it's not to treat sediment or to treat stormwater runoff in any way. It's really just to keep the downstream from getting flooded out. So a great purpose if it was only built for that, then you can do some minor repairs here and there to then turn it into a fully functioning modern stormwater treatment basin that also deals with flood control too, that does both at the same time. Yeah.
These are ones that are municipality.
So that's the easiest to get them to work with for sure, because they own it. However, you can naturalize any basin that's out there if you can deal with a willing landowner. But you have to get them to say, okay, to change it. And they have to have some partnership, usually, or some kind of, sometimes they're willing to do it, sometimes they maybe have a vested interest, Some people that are around pharmaceutical companies, for example, like they like to have an environmental profile. So sometimes talking to them can be easier. You know what I mean? If they have a basin, it's like, oh, sure. Especially if you're going to be the one that antes up the money to fix it on their behalf, and the township says it's okay, well, they're like, okay, go right ahead. This is the last one. This is a very, 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 very big one, though. This is they call it good housekeeping, and this has 3 separate parts to it, BMP1, BMP2, BMP3. And what it is that this is how the municipality takes care of all of its activities in-house or from contractors within their urbanized area. So the public works yard and how they're going to do their activities to not pollute from the public works yard. Has anybody ever been to a public works yard before? Yeah. Many of them are insanely bad, like insanely bad. Many of them, or a few of them, are really, really nice and actually were ran really well and look spotless. But there are some to where you would be amazed. It's just piles of stuff everywhere with the storm drain right here. Or I have absolutely gone out to do inspections and just watched them just hose everything off right there with oil, a whole trail of oil and grease going right to the storm drain. I have many stories about that. This is where this part of the permit is what's supposed to take care of it, and it does it in 3 separate ways, or in 3 components. Number 1 is that there's basically supposed to be a book that says all of the operations that are owned and operated by the permittee that have the potential for generating stormwater runoff. So the public works yard, the township, municipal building facility, it really should include police, fire, which is hardly ever included in that conversation, but it should. It should include how snow removal is done, how the de-icing materials are stored. It should include a big one, which is often overlooked, is if you have people doing utility repair work. And I was in an EPA inspection once where there was a concrete cutting saw, and they have the dust suppression in front of them where they shoot the water, and then all of that and a huge trail is just all draining off into the storm drain. And the EPA is just like, yes. So they walked out, saw this, and started immediately getting into the conversation. It wasn't the municipal workers that were doing it, but it doesn't matter because it's a contractor doing work within the MS4 defined area, and that's all that matters. So there is usually no dialogue amongst the municipal workers or minimal with the contractors that do this. I don't know that anybody is really enforcing this in a heavy-handed way, but I want to be really clear to you guys here that there's a part of this permit that covers all of that work. So they're supposed to, if anybody has their own wastewater treatment plant, that's absolutely included in there as well. It's not a really common thing, but it certainly exists out there. So this is how the parks department, how they wash their equipment, how Public Works does stuff, de-icing, all of these things, inlet. The management of their own BMPs, municipal BMPs. Besides being covered in the other thing that we just talked about, it's also kind of covered here. How often the inlets are cleaned out and the catch basins are cleaned out. Any kind of composting facilities? Do you guys work with municipalities that have those at all? Yeah. Those are interesting places to go to. I was in another EPA inspection where there was a giant pile of compost twice as high as the ceiling, all sitting right next to a storm drain that discharged within the distance from here to there to a stream, just dumping nutrients out as fast as it can go right to that stream. I don't know how much it is that you can work with from an EAC perspective, but I just want to make sure that you know that this is there. This would include, real quick, the documentation of what all those facilities are. And then it includes a written plan that shows how you're going to keep pollution from occurring from those activities that you just documented. But this is the one I think that has the most potential for folks to help with in the room. There's supposed to be an annual employee training for every person who would deal with those activities on how to do their job without polluting. So that illicit discharge training that we had just spoke about, that was something that I had put on for the Eastern Delaware Stormwater Collaborative, which is a collaborative group located right here. And that was a part of their annual training for public works staff, was how to go out and to look at inlets and how to trace back illicit discharges and things of those nature. So those folks who are MS4s who discharge to waters with a TMDL, like we had spoke about, or within 5 miles of an impaired water, need to map their area that is their area of interest for this analysis. And they call it a planning area. So what they're supposed to do is take the urbanized area and everything that then drains into the urbanized area. And that is your planning area. However, as we spoke about quite a bit before, there are rules that allow you to remove areas that you don't own in any way. So you can take industrial facilities that have their own permit, and you can discharge that out. You can take HOAs and other corporate-owned parks, and you can remove them from your area of interest. And then you can use any model you want to, although there's a basic one that people use to calculate a pollutant load. And then you take your pollutant load and you multiply that by 10%, and that total pollutant sediment load that you calculated from your area is then what you're required to mitigate or remove, and you're supposed to get a list of all the best management practices that you're going to insert or input into your municipality, implement, and then a time frame on when that's supposed to occur. And that should all be in a plan if your municipality is triggered to doing that.
Is there any plan to make that greater than just a 10% reduction? 'Cause that seems almost insignificant.
10%, so it seems like it is, but actually from somebody who's written a bunch of plans, it's actually really hard to do. So I get what you're saying, and over time there will be more. This will not go away, basically, is what I do want to get across. The 10% was a baby step. Everything about this mandatory reduction, the way to think about this is that the department wanted to baby step people into having to put in BMPs on the ground, which has never been done before. And so this was how to get all of that going. It sounds simple. I mean, my goodness, has it been, the rules are still changing as we speak. I mean, as we speak, even though this was put out and people were to have turned in their plans back in August of 2017, the rules are still evolving forward because it's just complicated. Municipalities in Pennsylvania, so I consider myself a stormwater advocate for sure. But having worked to try to get municipalities to that number, I can sympathize with the fact that the bottom line is they really do only own so much land. So if they're to go outside of that land that they own, they have to have a willing partnership. There is no law that says they can confiscate your property or demand that they can put in something else. And so in Pennsylvania, because of the tightness and because of the individual municipal sort of structure that we have, it actually does become pretty complicated to find projects to get to that number. And it can be really expensive for them to meet too. So I agree, it seems small, but man, when you start calculating all of that and then looking for areas that you have control over, it becomes very difficult. I think the way that this is showing up is a little weird. There it is, right there. If you go into PRP TMDL plans within this DEP website, I want everybody to know about this tool. There's something called the requirements table. And it tells you every single municipality. So again, Control F is like the tool. Ambler. Right there is Ambler Borough. It's all taken by county. And what it does is tell you the municipal name, their permit number. If there is no permit number, it means they're brand new. So it means they don't have a permit yet, but they're being brought into the system. So it'll tell you their existing permit number. It'll tell you if they are required to get an individual permit, and then it tells you why. Because there's a TMDL plan, because these guys discharge to the Wissahickon TMDL. So they're going from what is PAG, the G stands for general. If it's an individual, it'll say PAI. And that's the difference. It'll tell you why, because of a TMDL plan, and then you can see they discharge to the Wissahickon TMDL. And then they also have other pollution reduction plan requirements, though, because they discharge to other tributaries that would have, there's like a nutrient impairment for it right there. This tells you, this is a list of every single MS4 that is either existing or brought in, divided by county, again, telling them what it is that they need to create those pollution reduction plans or TMDL plans for. So I absolutely wanted everybody to know about this today before we left. This is it's MS4 requirements table. And again, if you go into the DEP Municipal Stormwater website, if you click on PRP/TMDL plans, there's a link that'll take you to this. One of the things that's evolved as the rules continue to change and shift is it used to be that everybody was just going to get permitted and be having their cycle start in March of this year. But because there's so much back and forth with the PRP and TMDL plans, they've decided, okay, all of the minimum control measures that we just talked about started back in March. But you're not going to start your 5-year clock to implement your BMPs for this PRP or TMDL purpose until you get your plan approved. So it's like 2 separate clocks that are going now that you wouldn't know about unless you knew that the PRP had been approved. And there is nothing that would say that unless you checked or knew with the municipality. Yeah, I can. So we talked about the minimum control measures, the public outreach, illicit discharge detection, good housekeeping. For all folks that have a general permit, those requirements under the new permit, like their new permit kicked in for them March of this year. So they're actually in it already. However, I'm going to wait for notes to be made. However, the pollution reduction plan, TMDL, time clock to get those things built does not start until the DEP approves your plan and gives it back to you. If you were to go through, look at your municipality's plan, chances are it's still being reviewed and isn't finalized at all, because that's where most of the plans sit out there. You can go through and look and say, like, does it even really make sense the way that they calculated the runoff? There can be, I mean, it sounds really simple, but there could be major just sort of errors that just occur. I know one example where they used the wrong numbers for what their sediment loading was supposed to be and pulling it from a certain table, and it really shortcut what they were supposed to do, and they kind of got called out for it. So there's just some basic, like even just accounting checks, if you wanted to, just to make sure that it made sense. Is there projects that you've been working on or are aware of that maybe they didn't know about and you just want to throw out there? It's like, just saying, you know, there's this whole buffer thing that we've got, or there's these basins that we could naturalize, and I think that we have a good relationship with these people, or you own them, or whatever, that could be included. The O&M, the operation and maintenance, was that really covered the way it's supposed to be? Is it clear that it's really going to get taken care of, or does it seem as though something that could get put in and forgot about? Do you work with an organization that could assist in getting some of the BMPs going? We're doing a couple kickoff projects for one collaborative effort that is, we specifically put in plugs so that we could get the citizens involved and have a citizen planting day. Just to get awareness, it meets the public involvement stuff that we were talking about from the MCMs. It gets the awareness that this plan is out there to the residents to see, and it gives them an opportunity to volunteer with some of the folks that are watershed organizations. So it's like you can seed, or you can do just plantings, and you can invite people to come out and do the plantings. If you are really adamant, I mean, again, it's like this is an adversarial role, but if you were concerned that there was some issues, of course, you could always try to, you know, get involved in having somebody check it on a higher level. But one thing I really want to talk about is you could also really try to convince people to work together in a larger scale across the watershed. We wrote the plan for all of the MS4s in Blair County. They're all working together to then put in BMPs across. This is 2 separate large watersheds. It's actually at that divide right there. We're working with, actually, I think a really great way to illustrate this is we're working with the city of Harrisburg and with the 2 suburban townships immediately next to them. This is a great example of why collaboration would work better. Harrisburg can't do anything. They hardly have any property, and it's all completely built out. So they can work in conjunction with their neighbors where there's more open space, more room for stream restoration, and more room for other basin retrofits and opportunities, and then everybody can pitch in together, split the bill, and then meet the pollution reduction plan or TMDL goals. Again, there is very little available land by which they have complete control over as a municipality. So the more you expand that, you are expanding the amount of reductions that need to get done, but everybody needs to hit their own reductions anyways. So you're just kind of compiling that, and then you're compiling everybody's available area, and you're compiling and splitting the price tag. So trying to make it more cost efficient to implement. So this is for pollution reduction plans, or TMDLs. Now, you need to come up with an intergovernmental agreement, and there are examples of those that exist out there that detail all the things that you're supposed to do. How people could split the costs, or what the O&M responsibilities would be, and how that gets decided. But yeah, there's Blair County, there's York County that we've worked with that's doing it. Here locally is the Eastern Delaware Stormwater Collaborative. They have several municipalities kind of going in. They're citing BMPs. They're taking advantage of some of the William Penn funds that was mentioned by Alex earlier to try to use some of the foundation money to get some of these projects put in. However, what I would really like you guys to understand is that the MCM 1 and 2 stuff that we talked about with the public participation, public involvement, like we spoke about before, you can absolutely work together in a larger group, and you could work together with other EACs or with other municipalities, and then everybody share these materials and put on trainings or do things together as a way to take that burden off of. You can do it collectively. You just have to make sure that you give everybody the paperwork they're supposed to have. Thoughts?